Someone stopped texting you back. No explanation, no goodbye, no reason, just silence. And the silence said something that no word ever could, that the relationship, whatever it was over, that you were not worth an explanation, that disappearing was easier than being honest. You know this feeling. Almost everyone alive today knows this feeling. It has a name so common it appears in mainstream dictionaries. Ghosting. The act of ending a relationship by simply ceasing to exist within it. But here is what nobody tells you when they explain the psychology of modern ghosting. It is not just a bad habit that some people have. It is not just rudeness dressed up in the language of self-protection. It is something far stranger and far more revealing than that. It is a behavior that was literally impossible for most of human history. Not difficult, not socially frowned upon, not risky. Impossible. Structurally, architecturally, completely impossible given the world that ancient humans actually lived in. And understanding why it was impossible tells you something profound, not just about ancient humans, but about what we have built in their place, and what we lost when we built it. The story of ghosting is not a story about modern rudeness. It is a story about what happens to human relationships when you remove the face. Let's go. To understand why ancient humans could not ghost anyone, you first have to understand the world they actually lived in. And that world was, by every modern measure, extraordinarily small. For the vast majority of human existence, for the roughly 300,000 years that anatomically modern Homo sapiens have walked the earth, and for the millions of years of hominid evolution before that, humans lived in small, mobile bands. Groups of between 30 and 150 individuals, occasionally larger for seasonal gatherings, but the functional social unit, the group you actually lived with and depended on for survival, was small enough that every single person in it was known to you personally. The anthropologist Robin Dunbar famously proposed in the early 1990s that the human brain has a cognitive limit of approximately 150 stable social relationships, a number now widely known as Dunbar's number. This is not a coincidence. It is a product of millions of years of evolution in exactly this kind of small group environment. The human social brain was built for a world of approximately 150 people, because that was the world. In that world, there were no strangers in your daily life. Everyone you encountered was someone you already knew. Someone you had grown up with, hunted alongside, shared food with, argued with, reconciled with, watched grow old. Your entire social universe was visible to you every day in a shared physical space that was almost never larger than a few kilometers. In this world, the very concept of disappearing from someone's life was incoherent. You woke up in the same camp. You gathered food in the same territory. You slept near the same fire. The person you might have wanted to avoid was going to be standing 10 meters away from you at sunrise, and at midday, and at dinner, and every day after that for the rest of your shared lives. Ghosting requires distance. And distance, in the ancient world, was almost never available. But here is where it gets more interesting. Because the impossibility of ghosting in the ancient world was not just physical, it was social, it was psychological, and it was survival-level practical in ways that most modern analyses completely miss. In a band of 150 people with no agriculture, no food storage of any significant scale, no individual property in the modern sense, and no way to survive outside the group, your relationships were not a matter of emotional preference. They were a matter of life and death. Think about what it actually meant to damage a relationship in this world. If you behaved badly toward another member of the group, if you lied, if you cheated, if you took without giving back, if you abandoned someone in a way that violated the group's understanding of how people ought to treat each other, you were not risking their feelings. You were risking your position in the only social structure that stood between you and death. Anthropologists who study modern hunter-gatherer societies, groups like the Kungsan of the Kalahari, the Hadza of Tanzania, the Agta of the Philippines, or the various groups of the Amazon basin who have maintained traditional ways of living, consistently observe the same thing. Reputation is everything, not in the shallow social media sense of how many people admire you, in the literal survival sense of whether people will share food with you when you have none, hunt alongside you when you need backup, care for you when you are sick, and vouch for you when conflict arises. Reputation in the ancient world was the most valuable resource a person could accumulate, and reputation was built from one thing above all others: how you treated people face to face, over time, consistently, in a world where everyone was watching. Now consider what ghosting would have meant in this context. Not the modern version, a blocked number, an unanswered message, a slow fade into digital silence. The ancient version would have required something far more dramatic and far more costly. To ghost someone in the ancient world, you would have had to be physically present with them every day while refusing to acknowledge their existence. You would have had to avoid eye contact, decline to speak, withdraw from shared activities, all in full view of every other member of the group who knew both of you and was carefully noting how each of you behaved. The social cost would have been immediate and catastrophic, not because ghosting would have been considered rude, but because it would have signaled something far more alarming to the group, that you were someone who could not manage conflict, who could not maintain the social fabric that kept everyone alive, who was willing to fracture group cohesion for personal emotional convenience. That signal could get you killed, not metaphorically, literally. Groups that could not manage internal conflict effectively did not survive. But archaeologists have found something that makes this picture even more vivid. And it is not what you might expect. For decades, the assumption in paleoanthropology was that ancient human social life was primarily driven by dominance hierarchies. The strongest individual dominated the group, controlled resources, and determined outcomes. This was the standard narrative: alpha individuals, submission and deference, brute force as the organizing principle. Then researchers began studying the archaeology of ancient social behavior more carefully, and what they found changed the picture significantly. At sites across Africa, Europe, and Asia, from the cave paintings of Lascaux in southern France to the ochre engravings of Blombos Cave in South Africa, dated to approximately 77,000 years ago, the evidence of ancient human social life tells a consistent story. Ancient humans were not primarily organized around dominance. They were organized around reciprocity, around the careful, continuous management of social relationships through communication, gift exchange, shared ritual, and the public negotiation of conflict. Christopher Boehm, an anthropologist at the University of Southern California, spent decades studying what he calls reverse dominance hierarchies in hunter-gatherer societies. His conclusion, published in his landmark work Hierarchy in the Forest, is striking. Hunter-gatherer societies are not dominated by alpha individuals. They are actively, consistently, and deliberately egalitarian. When any individual attempts to dominate, the rest of the group works together to suppress that dominance, through mockery, criticism, ostracism, and in extreme cases, violence. In this kind of society, the social skills required for survival were not the skills of the physically strongest. They were the skills of the most socially skilled, the person who could read other people's emotional states accurately, who could navigate conflict without escalating it, who could maintain relationships under stress, who could, in short, deal with difficult social situations directly rather than avoiding them. Ghosting is the opposite of this. It is the avoidance of direct communication, the refusal to navigate conflict, the choice of personal comfort over social responsibility. In an ancient band, this was not just bad manners. It was a signal of social incompetence so severe that it threatened the individual's position in the group. And there is one more layer to this that almost no one discusses: the role of language itself. Paleoanthropologists have long debated when modern human language, complex, symbolic, syntactically rich language capable of expressing nuance, abstraction, and emotional experience, first appeared. The evidence is contested, but most researchers now believe that something like modern language capacity was present in Homo sapiens from close to our species' emergence, around 300,000 years ago, and possibly even earlier in ancestral species. What matters for our purposes is not the exact timeline, but the function. Language in the ancient world was not primarily a tool for transmitting information. It was primarily a social technology, a tool for managing relationships, building coalitions, negotiating conflicts, expressing grievances, and maintaining the social glue that held the group together. Robin Dunbar himself proposed the social brain hypothesis, the idea that the primate brain, and particularly the human brain, grew large not primarily to solve ecological problems like navigation or tool use, but to manage the complexity of large social groups. Language, in this framework, evolved as a kind of social grooming, a way of maintaining multiple relationships simultaneously that physical grooming, which requires one-on-one contact, could not scale to handle. In this world, refusing to speak to someone was not silence, it was a communication. a powerful, highly visible, socially disruptive communication that the entire group would observe and interpret. There was no way to withdraw from a relationship quietly. There was no private channel through which a relationship could simply be allowed to expire without anyone noticing. Every relationship in the ancient world existed in public, was maintained in public, was damaged in public, was repaired in public. The idea of a relationship that ended invisibly, that just faded without discussion or acknowledgement, would have been genuinely bizarre. Not because ancient humans were more emotionally mature or more considerate, but because the social architecture made invisible endings structurally impossible. Yet the biggest mystery in all of this was still waiting. If ancient humans were so thoroughly equipped by environment, by social structure, by the hard requirements of survival to deal with each other directly and honestly, why are modern humans so catastrophically bad at it? The answer is not that modern humans are morally inferior to ancient ones. The answer is that we built a world that systematically removed every structural pressure that made direct communication necessary. And having removed those pressures, we discovered that the social skills they produced were not built into us at a deep level. They were produced by the environment. Change the environment, and the behavior changes with it. Consider what the digital world actually is from the perspective of the ancient social brain. It is a world of relationships without physical presence, without the continuous observation of shared social life, without the reputation consequences that make dishonesty and avoidance catastrophically costly, without the survival stakes that make conflict resolution a matter of life and death rather than emotional preference. In this world, the cost of ghosting approaches zero. You do not have to see the person tomorrow. You do not have to manage their reaction in real time. You do not have to navigate the group's judgment of your behavior. You do not have to live in close proximity to the consequences of your choice. You can simply stop responding and the relationship ceases to exist, quietly and privately, in a way that costs you almost nothing in the short term. And when the cost of something approaches zero, the behavior associated with that cost increases. This is not a moral failure. It is a rational response to a changed cost structure. The ancient world made ghosting catastrophically expensive. The modern world made it nearly free, and so it became common. Research published in the Journal of Social and Personal Relationships in recent years has begun to document the scale of the phenomenon. Studies suggest that somewhere between 20 and 30% of dating app users report having been ghosted, and similar proportions report having ghosted others. Some estimates are considerably higher, and the phenomenon is not limited to romantic relationships. Workplace ghosting, simply not showing up for interviews, failing to respond to job offers, disappearing mid-project, has increased dramatically in recent years, to the point where major employers have begun building it into their planning assumptions. The social cost that once made this behavior unthinkable has not disappeared. It has simply been deferred, distributed, and made invisible by the architecture of digital life. But there is something happening in the neuroscience of ghosting that makes the ancient perspective even more relevant, because the brain that receives ghosting is still, in all the ways that matter, an ancient brain. And an ancient brain processes ghosting as something far more serious than a rude communication style. Research on social rejection has consistently shown that the neural response to social exclusion activates the same brain regions as physical pain. The anterior cingulate cortex and the anterior insula, regions associated with the experience of physical pain, light up under brain imaging when subjects experience social rejection. This is not a metaphor. The brain genuinely does not have a clean neurological distinction between being physically hurt and being socially excluded. Matthew Lieberman, a social neuroscientist at UCLA, has argued in his research that this overlap is not coincidental. It reflects the evolutionary reality of an organism for whom social rejection was genuinely life-threatening. The pain of social exclusion, in the ancient world, was a warning signal as serious as the pain of physical injury, because the consequences were equally severe. When you are ghosted and it hurts in a way that feels disproportionate to the situation, when you find yourself cycling through it repeatedly, searching for an explanation, feeling rejected at a level that seems deeper than the relationship warranted, you are not being oversensitive. You are being ancient. Your brain is responding to social exclusion with the full weight of its evolutionary programming, which was built for a world where social exclusion meant death. The lack of explanation that defines ghosting makes this worse, not better. In the ancient world, conflict always produced information. An argument told you where you stood. A confrontation, however painful, gave you data about the relationship, about the other person, about what had gone wrong and whether it could be repaired. Ancient humans processed conflict socially and verbally because that processing was how the group maintained its coherence. Ghosting denies the brain the information it was built to extract from conflict. It leaves the ancient social processing system running without the input it needs to complete its cycle. The mind keeps returning to the question, what happened? What did I do wrong? Can it be repaired? Because those questions were always answered in the ancient world, and the brain has not yet learned that in the modern world they sometimes cannot be. What does archaeology tell us about how ancient humans actually ended relationships? The evidence is necessarily indirect. Behavior leaves no bones. But the anthropological record of living hunter-gatherer societies gives us a detailed picture. Among the Hadza of Tanzania, one of the most thoroughly studied hunter-gatherer societies in the world, researchers have documented a consistent pattern of conflict resolution through what might be called radical transparency. Grievances are aired publicly, often loudly. Other group members become involved not as passive observers but as active participants in the resolution. The goal is not to determine who was right and who was wrong, but to restore the social equilibrium that the conflict has disrupted. Relationships that cannot be repaired are ended, but they are ended explicitly. The group knows, the parties know, there is no ambiguity about the status of the relationship, because ambiguity about the social structure of the group is itself a threat to group cohesion. Clarity, even painful clarity, is preferable to the unresolved uncertainty of a relationship that has simply gone quiet. Among the Kung San of the Kalahari, anthropologist Richard Lee documented in his landmark research that the group response to persistent interpersonal conflict was not the quiet withdrawal of one party, it was discussion, mediation, and in cases where resolution was impossible, a physical separation, one party moving to live with another band for a period. This separation was discussed openly, understood by all, and carried no permanent social stigma. It was a structural solution to an interpersonal problem, managed collectively and transparently. The contrast with modern ghosting could not be more stark. Ancient relationship endings were public, discussed, acknowledged, and processed collectively. Modern ghosting is private, undiscussed, unacknowledged, and processed alone, by the person who receives it, in isolation, without the social resources that the ancient brain was built to rely on. Here is what the evidence from archaeology, anthropology, neuroscience, and evolutionary biology converges on. Ghosting is not simply a modern rudeness. It is a mismatch between an ancient social brain and a modern communication architecture. The brain was built for a world of radical social transparency, where all relationships existed in public, where the consequences of avoidance were immediate and severe, and where the skills of direct communication were survival requirements rather than character preferences. The modern world removed all of those conditions. It created private communication channels where relationships can exist and end without witnesses. It reduced the consequences of avoidance to near zero. And it replaced the survival stakes of ancient social life with the optional, low-cost, easily abandoned connections of digital interaction. In doing so, it did not change the human brain. It changed the environment around the brain. And the brain, responding to a changed environment with behavior that made perfect sense in the old one, finds itself producing responses: the disproportionate pain of rejection, the obsessive need for an explanation, the inability to simply let an unanswered message go, that feel out of scale to the modern situation, but are precisely calibrated to the ancient one. You are not too sensitive for this world. You are correctly calibrated for a different one. And the person who ghosted you? They are also not simply rude. They are a human being in a world that has made avoidance nearly free, direct communication costly, and radical social transparency completely optional. They are responding to the cost structure of the modern world exactly as the ancient human responded to the cost structure of theirs. The difference is that the ancient cost structure produced people who could talk to each other about difficult things, and the modern one is producing people who increasingly cannot. There are no grand solutions in this observation. You cannot rebuild the ancient world. You cannot make social consequences permanent and unavoidable in a world of digital distance. But you can recognize what is happening when ghosting hurts more than seems rational. You can understand that the hurt is not evidence of weakness. It is evidence of a brain that was built for human beings to actually deal with each other. And you can, in your own life, in your own relationships, choose to pay the cost that the modern world no longer requires. You can say the difficult thing. You can have the conversation that digital architecture has made optional. You can restore, in your small corner of the world, the radical transparency that your brain was built for and that your ancient ancestors had no choice but to maintain. Not because it is easier. It is not. It is considerably harder than simply going quiet. But because the ancient humans who never ghosted anyone were not better people than you. They were people living in a world that made honesty the only viable option. And there is something worth considering in that. About what we have built, about what it has cost us, and about what we might choose to rebuild, one honest conversation at a time.